illustrated a few years ago, and it's about Alice Keitler, who some of you might have heard of. She's known as the Witch of Kilkenny, and this is the fictionalised account of her life. Once upon a time, a very, very long time ago, but not so very far away, there was a beautiful woman who went to the bad, possibly. This story is almost true. Her name was Alice, A-L-I-C-E, or Elise, A-L-Y-S, or Aliz, A-L-I-Z. The spelling was optional back then. She lived in Kilkenny town, and she had not only beauty of face, but also a shrewd intellect, a lethal combination, and a fateful one. She'd also learnt from a very young age how to handle herbs. And this was becoming incredibly dangerous at a time when men were just beginning to take over the medical profession. Sorry. In babyhood, she was so beautiful that women cooed and petted. As she got older, the cooing and petting continued, but the women stopped doing it and the men started. This tends to happen. As Alice grew to maturity, men clustered round her, besotted into blinkers, blind to her faults. They vied for her attention, and she revelled in it. Many people, particularly women, shook their heads at her flightiness. Alice didn't care. She took a husband, but as so many unfortunately discover, she found that the effects of being in love wear off. And her husband went from thinking her perfect to thinking that she needed work, as is the way. Her own love faded and boredom took its place. Then the husband died, and people who'd noticed that the honeymoon period was over wondered and pondered over the death and at so young an age of so robust a man, and they talked. Alice, however, hadn't learned her lesson about marriage, or perhaps, as she'd benefited so much financially from the death of the first one, she'd learned a different lesson. She soon took another husband, who died, and then another, who died, and then one more, who died. Alice had discovered an interest in marrying wealthy men. None of them outlived her waning interest, and in every marriage, her interest waned all too quickly. People talked even more, and Alice continued to ignore them. Each husband upon dying had left her even wealthier. She became a moneylender, and her wealth grew. She flaunted it and her independence in a time in society when few women had either. People began to call her Dame Alice, and it wasn't always with respect. Her arrogance grew, and she had nothing but contempt for men who tried too often to control her, although she did enjoy playing with them. Nor did she care for the laws or the morals of her time. Her servants copied her, especially one flighty maid called Petronella, who swayed around town in her mistress's cast-off dresses and flirted even more than Alice did. People talked harder. Living like this, Alice soon came to the attention of a local bishop called Ledred. He too was arrogant, but considered that his calling and his sex made him entitled to be so. Alice refused to go to church even on Sundays, having no patience with sermons, and this was a time when everyone was expected to go every day. Bishop Ledred took it upon himself to visit and to reprove her, both for her non-attendance at church and for her peculiar form of morality. Now, this was nearly 1,000 years ago, and in Ireland in those days, some of you may well know, priests were allowed to marry. So, in spite of his vestments, the bishop was also a man, and thus susceptible to beauty. And so he propositioned even while he preached. give herself to him, and he would, he implied, protect her from the wagging tongues of the diocese. Alice cared nothing for wagging tongues, and even less for this posturing, pompous priest. He was not a pretty man, and she demanded beauty in her lovers. With carrot-coloured hair, a face marked by pox, and staring milky grey eyes like a 3-day-old dead trout, he had nothing she wanted, and she told him so. She laughed at him, chided him for his hypocrisy, spurned his advances with utter contempt, and even encouraged her maid to join in, who did quite willingly. The bishop's lust warred with growing fury. He strode away, their jeers still ringing in his ears, and vowed to bring both of these uppity young women to their knees before him. What he would do to them when they were at his mercy filled his head with visions unsuited to his cloth, but they comforted him greatly. A powerful man, Ledred was not slow to begin his campaign against the women. He summoned countless members of his flock and interrogated them about the two women. Where he found malice, he found it. Where he found indifference, he made his displeasure plain. He encouraged wild surmises, and if they discredited either of the women, and only too soon, he had his case. Alice, a noted herbalist, had been heard to say that there were few problems which could not be cured if you knew your herbs, and all 4 of her husbands had become a problem and had died. In his eyes and the eyes of his congregation, both mistress and maid were witches, and Alice had murdered all 4 of her husbands. Almost certainly, perhaps even definitely, abetted by that saucy minx of a maid. The bishop gloated. He had them both. They would grovel and they would burn. But before they did, while Ledred revelled in his fantasies, Elise was well aware of what was going on. In spite of her marriages and the rumour mill, men still flocked to visit her. She listened to what they had to tell her, and she planned, and she thought, and she planned. She'd picked up some influential friends, all of them men, and she called in some favours, and persuaded 1 or 2 of these men to have a word with the bishop. He was duly told to back off or end up in court himself. For a while the bishop did, but he simmered, and Alice could not refrain from giving him amused glances and pert looks whenever they encountered each other in town. Her barely concealed contempt lit another flame under his simmer. He decided to defy her supporters. He had, he felt, plenty of supporters of his own. So the summons to the ecclesiastical court was duly delivered. Alice was well prepared, having known by then that her defenders had failed to quieten the bishop forever. Both mistress and maid attended the court more demurely dressed than they had been for a long time. Petronilla, sillier than her mistress as well as flightier, was certain that her own charms, and of course those of her mistress, would sway any man, even ecclesiastical ones. Alice wasn't so sure, but she'd laid plans. Prepared or not, even Alice was confounded by the depth of the bishop's hostility and by the thoroughness of his preparation. Ledred thundered and denounced and called upon an abundant supply of willing and not so willing witnesses to support his accusations. Alice had been seen turning into a hare, one witness declared. Hares were commonly believed to be witches in disguise in those days, and a hare had been seen, so who else could it be? She'd been conjuring spells at midnight under a full moon, said another. Although she hadn't actually been seen doing so, she must have. She was a witch, wasn't she? And that was what witches did. She'd conjured up a demon in the shape of a big black dog and had lain with him, said a third. Again, nobody had actually witnessed this, but she did have a big black dog. And everybody agreed that was the sort of thing that demons and witches got up to. And she had, of course, all were in agreement, poisoned all four of her husbands. Alice had been a very busy woman. Alice was determined, however, not to give any satisfaction to the bishop. She lifted her chin and regarded him and the court steadily and calmly, which infuriated the bishop beyond bearing. He wanted to see her cower. He needed to see her collapse and grovel. Petronilla at least was beginning to look frightened. Did Elise not realise what danger they were in? However, she had quickly seen that the verdict of the court was inevitable. The bishop had done his work only too well. Her judges were refusing to look at her, other than for occasional furtive glances out of the corner of her eye. Even one of them was even leering at her, and Alice was used to leers. She knew what that meant. When they wouldn't look at you, they thought you were guilty. Petronilla, though, in spite of her growing fear, was also gathering more looks, and the case against her was even flimsier, if that is possible, and far more circumstantial. There was no real evidence to link her with the actions of her mistress, and even in 13th century Catholic Ireland, it wasn't actually a capital crime to be a saucy flibbertigibbet. The bishop grew impatient, with occasional doubtful looks on the jury's faces. Spittle flew from his mouth as he raged and he thundered and he denounced. And many began to give him increasing, measuring looks. Alice had not stopped scheming. She was not that type of woman. And she was still hoping that Petronilla might be found innocent. The trial seemed endless, and at the end of each weary day, the women were allowed to go home, albeit escorted, where they'd fall into exhausted slumber. Neither slept well, while the bishop glowed with confidence. Alice did her best to wind up her business affairs. She sold many of her interests. On the eve of what both women were certain to be the day of decision, they sat talking about what they were going to do. Alice urged her maid to fly. She promised funds and help to escape. But Petronilla was not very bright. She talked herself into believing that she was too pretty to die. Anyway, there were one or two flirts on the jury who looked promising. All of Elise's warnings were in vain. The next morning the court opened, and Elise wasn't there. Petronilla stammered without much conviction that her mistress had been taken ill, and would be there later when she felt a little better. The bishop gloated. He was, true, disappointed that Elise was not there to hear the court's verdict, and duly sent men to fetch her to the court, ill or not, bring her on a stretcher if they had to, break down the door if they had to, carry her on a pallet, she had to be there. Meanwhile, Alice and Petronilla were found guilty and sentenced to die. But the bishop's men came back empty-handed. Dame Alice had gone. In rage and frustration over the missing woman, the bishop demanded the maximum penalty for the maid. The case against her for witchcraft was slight, but that would not deter him. So while Dame Alice was fleeing the country, with plenty of her property now recently converted into gold, poor Petronilla was being tortured. The bishop did so enjoy that. And while the mistress was sailing away, the maid was being burnt at the stake. Whether she would have felt comforted to know that she was the first woman in Europe to be burnt at the stake is again your choice. If you're waiting for a moral, all I can say is that Alice is believed to have lived happily ever after in Scotland, if such a thing is possible.